August 3, 1976. Brooklyn, New York. A humid night pressed down on the borough like a wet cloth. Maria Pappas left the nightclub just after 2:17 a.m. She was 24. Blonde. Greek-American. A hostess at a club frequented by wise guys who tipped in cash and never gave last names. The street was quiet. Too quiet. A Bic idled across the block. She never reached her car. Witnesses later said they heard a door slam. No scream. No gunshot. By sunrise, Maria was gone. Her body surfaced 3 days later in Jamaica Bay. Hands bound. Bruised ribs. No bullets. No knife wounds. The newspapers called it a jealous lover killing. The police called it undetermined. But inside the Bonanno crime family, men whispered a different explanation. Maria had seen something. Something she was never meant to see. And unlike the film Donnie Brasco, there was no dramatic confrontation. No courtroom monologue. No cinematic justice. Just a quiet decision. Made in a back room. Signed off with a nod. Because in that world, being close to power was more dangerous than being its enemy. Brooklyn in the mid-1970s was not the romantic underworld later sold to audiences. It was bankrupt. Violent. Rotting from the inside out. New York City stood on the edge of fiscal collapse in 1975. Garbage piled in the streets. Police morale was low. Entire neighborhoods felt abandoned. In that vacuum, organized crime did not simply survive. It governed. Maria Pappas grew up in a tight Greek-American household near Bay Ridge. Church on Sundays. Family dinners. Strict father. Protective brothers. She wanted independence. Manhattan dreams. Instead, she found herself working nights in Brooklyn's club scene. Velvet ropes, mirrored walls, men in tailored suits who never carried wallets, only folded bills. The club was technically legitimate. Liquor license in order. Tax filing submitted. But ownership traced quietly back to men connected to the Bonanno crime family. That mattered. Because by 1976, the Bonannos were unstable. Leadership fractures had been brewing since the early 1960s. After the failed power grab known as the Bonanno War, the family's authority had weakened. Acting bosses rotated. Capos maneuvered. Loyalty was currency. Suspicion was oxygen. Maria did not understand the hierarchy. At the top sat the boss. Beneath him, the underboss and consigliere. Then capo regimes controlling crews. Soldiers beneath them. Associates on the fringe, useful, expendable, deniable. Nightclub hostesses were not part of the structure, but they orbited it. She greeted captains by first name. Knew who preferred which table. Understood when to clear the room. When to ignore arguments. When to pretend not to hear discussions about packages, shipments, and problems. In public, these men were charming. Tipped well. Sent flowers. Talked about family values. In private, they debated extortion routes, hijackings at JFK, and who might be talking to the FBI. Maria's mistake was proximity. She became familiar with men who were themselves under extraordinary pressure. Among them were associates aligned with Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero and rising capo Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, both operating in an environment thick with paranoia. The federal government had begun tightening its strategy. Surveillance expanded. Informants multiplied. The Mafia was no longer fighting street gangs. It was fighting prosecutors with wiretaps. Maria saw arguments escalate behind closed doors. She saw envelopes change hands after tense meetings. She saw men who returned 1 week and vanished the next. But she was not political, not strategic, not ambitious. She was simply present. And in a collapsing criminal empire, being present could be fatal. By 1976, the Bonanno crime family was a wounded institution trying to reassert control. Unlike the more stable hierarchies of the Gambino crime family or the Genovese crime family, the Bonannos had spent more than a decade fractured by internal rebellion. The failed 1960s coup attempt had weakened central authority. Informants had already exposed vulnerabilities. Federal prosecutors were circling. In that instability, ambitious men saw opportunity. Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano was one of them. A disciplined capo. Calculating. Respected for his earning power and ruthlessness. He controlled a crew operating out of Brooklyn social clubs that doubled as strategic command centers. Under him operated soldiers like Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero. Lefty was not polished. He was not wealthy. But he was loyal. Tirelessly so. A street operator who believed in hierarchy, in rules, in silence. And in 1976, both men were unknowingly standing at the center of a federal infiltration that would later become infamous. Joseph Pistone, the undercover FBI agent who would eventually be known publicly through the film Donnie Brasco, had begun embedding himself inside Bonanno circles. At first, he was merely an associate, a jewel thief with connections. Harmless. But inside a mafia family already haunted by suspicion, even harmless men created tension. Napolitano's crew became one of the circles Pistone penetrated most deeply. Meetings multiplied. Deals were discussed. Trust was tested. The hierarchy demanded vigilance. A boss could not survive betrayal. A capo could not tolerate weakness. A soldier could not question orders. And anyone close to that structure, even civilians, became part of the security perimeter. The club where Maria worked was not just nightlife. It was neutral ground. Conversations happened there because noise provided cover. Music masked whispers. Alcohol loosened tongues. Lefty brought Pistone there. So did others. Maria saw them together often. She noticed the way Pistone listened more than he spoke. The way Napolitano sometimes lowered his voice when argument sharpened. The way meetings grew more frequent after whispers of indictment spread through Brooklyn. Across New York, federal prosecutors were refining the use of conspiracy statutes that would later be weaponized through RICO. Surveillance teams were patient. They did not need dramatic arrests. They needed patterns. Inside the Bonannos, tension hardened. Crew members began disappearing from certain discussions. Loyalty oaths were repeated. Backgrounds were quietly rechecked. And in that atmosphere, proximity became risk. Maria did not know about wiretaps. She did not know about undercover operations. She did not know that suspicion was metastasizing inside the very men who smiled at her nightly. But she did know something had changed. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Doors were shut faster. Arguments became sharper. And in organized crime, when paranoia rises, someone always pays for it. Paranoia does not explode. It spreads. Quietly. Systematically. By late summer 1976, Pressure around the Bonanno crime family had intensified. Federal surveillance was expanding across Brooklyn and Queens. Grand juries were convening. Indictments were rumored before they were printed. Inside Napolitano's crew, conversations shifted tone. Men who once joked openly now spoke in fragments. Meetings moved locations. Certain associates were kept outside the room. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was evaluated. The turning point came on an ordinary night. A closed-door discussion. Low voices. The word indictment spoken more than once. A reference to shipments being watched. Someone mentioned a leak. Maria was not meant to hear any of it. But doors in nightclubs are thin. And tension makes men careless. She later asked a simple question. Too simple. Is everything okay? Silence followed. It was not the question itself. It was what it implied. She had noticed. She had observed a change in rhythm. In criminal organizations, awareness equals risk. Around the same time, internal suspicion about infiltration deepened. Though Joseph Pistone's identity was still undiscovered, unease grew about how federal agents seemed to anticipate movements. Someone was talking. Or listening. Napolitano tightened access. Lefty grew more anxious. Associates were reminded of the code. Civilians do not know business. Maria had crossed an invisible boundary. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But she had become aware that something was wrong inside a structure built entirely on secrecy. And when secrecy cracks, containment begins. The decision was not immediate. It never is. But from that night forward, Maria was no longer just a hostess. She was a potential variable. And variables are eliminated. The mid-1970s marked a shift in the war between organized crime and the federal government. It was no longer about isolated arrests. It was about dismantling structures. In 1970, Congress had passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. At first, it seemed abstract, complex, untested. But by the mid-decade, federal prosecutors began refining it into a surgical weapon. Instead of arresting one soldier for one crime, they could indict an entire hierarchy for patterns of behavior. Conspiracy became the battlefield. Across New York, U.S. attorneys coordinated investigations targeting all 5 families: the Bonanno crime family, the Gambino crime family, the Genovese crime family, the Lucchese, and the Colombo organizations. Surveillance vans became common sights in Brooklyn. Wiretap applications increased. Informants were cultivated with patience. Organized crime responded the only way it knew how. Internal discipline hardened. Meetings were smaller. Discussions shorter. Background checks more aggressive. Loyalty was not emotional. It was strategic. Inside Napolitano's crew, the fear was not abstract law enforcement. It was infiltration. The political climate made paranoia rational. The government wanted conspiracies. That meant they needed insiders. That meant someone close was vulnerable. Publicly, the Mafia presented an image of stability: social clubs open, weddings celebrated, church attended. Privately, the environment was tightening into something claustrophobic. Every loose end became a liability. Every witness became a risk. Maria existed outside the hierarchy, but within its perimeter. She was not sworn, not protected by oath, not bound by omerta. From a strategic standpoint, that made her dangerous. The logic was cold. If federal agents were listening, through wires, through informants, through proximity, then anyone who might unintentionally validate suspicions had to be neutralized. Not because she had betrayed them, but because she could. Political pressure does not just produce arrests. It produces overcorrection. And overcorrection produces tragedy. By early August 1976, fear inside the crew had matured into something decisive. Containment was no longer theoretical. It was operational. The order was never written. It never needed to be. Inside the Bonanno crime family, decisions traveled through tone, not paperwork. A raised eyebrow. A quiet remark. A meeting that included fewer chairs than usual. Maria's name was not discussed in dramatic fashion. It surfaced cautiously. She hears too much. She asks questions. She's around too often. No accusation of betrayal. No evidence of cooperation. Only risk assessment. Napolitano's crew was under pressure. Federal strategy had forced families into survival mode. If infiltration existed, and many believed it did, exposure could not come from sworn men alone. It could come from girlfriends, bartenders, hostesses. Civilians lacked discipline. Civilians panicked. Civilians talked. That was the fear. The public narrative would later suggest jealousy. A boyfriend. A private dispute. That explanation was convenient. It reduced the story to personal tragedy. The private motive was different. Stability. Containment. Control. Maria began to feel distance. Invitations stopped. Certain regulars no longer lingered at her podium. Conversations that once flowed casually now ended when she approached. Isolation is the first stage of erasure. By late July, discussions inside the crew turned practical. Not emotional. Not vindictive. Practical. If she remained close, the risk remained alive. If she disappeared, the risk disappeared with her. The authorization did not come from the boss directly. It did not need to. Mid-level leadership had discretion when security was threatened. A nod was enough. No theatrics. No ceremony. Just a decision. And on August 3, 1976, the machinery of that decision moved quietly into place. The club closed without incident. Music faded. Chairs stacked. Cash counted. Maria stepped into the humid night expecting nothing unusual. The BIC was already waiting. 2 men inside. Faces familiar enough not to alarm her. In organized crime, violence rarely arrives disguised as strangers. It arrives wearing recognition. She was told they needed to talk. Briefly. About something she had supposedly said. A misunderstanding. It would take 5 minutes. She entered the car willingly. That mattered. There was no struggle on the sidewalk. No witness intervention. No public spectacle. Inside the vehicle, the tone changed. Questions first. Calm. Direct. What did you hear? Who did you mention it to? Her answers were likely confused. Defensive. Incomplete. She did not understand the scale of the fear surrounding her. Paranoia does not require proof. It requires possibility. When the car left Brooklyn and headed toward the quieter edges near Jamaica Bay, the decision was already irreversible. There was no gunshot. Gunshots attract attention. Create paperwork. Invite ballistic analysis. The method was quieter. Hands. Force. Pressure. Bruised ribs. Oxygen cut off. Clinical. Efficient. Her body was bound and discarded in water not far from where fishermen would later discover her. No symbolic message. No theatrical staging. Just removal. Inside the crew, the subject closed quickly. No celebration. No extended discussion. The logic was simple. A potential leak had been sealed. But paranoia does not disappear after one act. It grows. And within a few years, the real infiltration, the one they feared, would destroy them anyway. By the time dawn broke over Brooklyn, the city knew nothing. The newspapers filed a small, unremarkable story: a young woman missing. A body later found in Jamaica Bay. Possibly a lover's quarrel, they wrote. The word Mafia never appeared. Not once. Inside the Bonanno family, there was relief. Quiet. Calculated. The perceived threat had vanished without fanfare. But the ripple effects were already spreading. Napolitano's crew remained under pressure. Federal investigations intensified. FBI surveillance, wiretaps, and informants were already embedded in operations. Trust was fraying at every level. What had been a calculated removal of a civilian became a lesson in control, and an omen. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, unaware of the full extent of Maria's fate at first, continued to navigate the line between loyalty and survival. Meetings with Joseph Pistone, the undercover agent, continued. Every handshake, every whispered word, now carried the weight of unseen consequences. Over the next several years, the Bonanno family would endure indictments, convictions, and betrayals. The internal paranoia that led to Maria's death was mirrored in every crew, every capo, every soldier who began to question. Who could they trust? Publicly, the case faded. Crime reporting in New York during the 1970s was fragmented, sensationalized, and limited by the press's access. Privately, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder that proximity to power could be more dangerous than outright opposition. Her name survived only in hushed recollections among crew members and later in testimonies during Bonanno trials. But no one outside the circle knew the full story. The system that killed her, quiet, methodical, unremarkable, proved both its efficiency and its cruelty. August 3, 1976, closes the loop. Maria Pappas' life ended not with spectacle, but with the quiet precision of survival logic. She was never a soldier. She was never an enemy. She was collateral, a variable in a world where silence was currency and suspicion dictated action. Organized crime does not always roar. Often, it whispers. It eliminates what threatens its equilibrium before headlines form. Its power is not only in extortion or violence, but in the invisible networks that dictate who exists and who does not. The Bonanno family, like all hierarchies of control, relied on fear as a stabilizer. But fear is imperfect. Paranoia consumes even the powerful, forcing them to destroy not enemies, but shadows. Maria's death illuminates the hidden calculus of organized crime. Proximity is perilous. Knowledge is dangerous. Presence alone can provoke elimination. The system thrives not by honor, but by containment. Yet there is a haunting symmetry. The very act meant to protect the family could not shield it from the infiltration that would follow. Decisions made in fear are temporary, consequences endure. In the end, the story is less about the murder itself and more about the philosophy of power. It survives through erasure, through the removal of variables, through the control of perception. Maria Pappas is a footnote in history. But in that footnote lies a truth. To touch the edges of power is to risk vanishing quietly. The night returns. Brooklyn sleeps. The Bic waits. The music fades. And the world moves on, unaware of the lives extinguished to maintain its balance. The lesson lingers. In the shadows of authority, innocence is never protected. It is negotiable.